Oh no, is this an argument about proving a negative? Okay, let's do it.
Debate community talks number 2, can you prove a negative? A lot of people say you cannot prove a negative. Yes, you can. Here's an example. Premise 1, if theism is true, then God exists. Premise 2, God does not exist. Conclusion, therefore theism is not true. God simultaneously being non-existent and theism being true is impossible because God's existence logically follows from theism. So knowing B follows from A, and knowing that B is not true means that A is also not true. This is the essence of the modus tollens argument. Debate community talks number 2, can you prove a negative? A lot of people say you cannot prove a negative. Yes, you can. Here's an example. Premise 1, if theism is true, then God exists.
Premise 1, if theism is true, then God exists. Premise 2, God doesn't exist. Conclusion, therefore theism is not true. That's not proving a negative, though.
Premise 2, God does not exist. Conclusion, therefore theism is not true. God simultaneously being non-existent and theism being true is impossible because God's existence logically follows from theism. So knowing B
A implies B is not true. Therefore, A isn't true. But this is making the assumption that there isn't a God. What?
follows from A, and knowing that B is not true means that A is also not true. This is the essence of the modus tollens argument.
Bigger than any Twitch political Discord? What does that mean? If you have peanut butter, then you always make peanut butter sandwiches. Since you didn't make peanut butter sandwiches, you don't have peanut butter. Right, so that's not proving a negative. Proving a negative is like saying, so he's saying within his thing, all right, this isn't proving a negative. This is a form of logic, not a form of proof. This isn't like the scientific method or something. This is just logic. This is premise 1, if theism is true, then God exists. Premise 2, God doesn't exist. Conclusion, therefore theism is not true. So, yes, premise 2 and premise 1 cannot exist at the same time. But since God doesn't exist, that means that within this line of logic, God doesn't exist. But that's not proof. That's just the correct form of logic. That's it. But that has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not you proved something. So if I say, it's like saying, can you prove, I say the Nazis killed Jews, and you say, no, the Nazis didn't kill Jews, and I say, prove they didn't kill Jews. Well, you can't really go about proving that they didn't commit an action. All you can do is prove the absence of that action, right? Like, you can't prove that someone didn't do something. That doesn't make sense. That's an illogical thought process. You can't prove that someone didn't do something. You can only prove things that did happen. You can't prove things that didn't happen, right? So you can prove the absence of something happening. So you can say, like your glass of milk, prove that he didn't pour the glass of milk, prove that he didn't pour the milk into the glass. Well, I can't prove that he didn't pour the milk into the glass. That doesn't make sense. There's no way to prove that someone didn't do something. Because the absence of them doing something, there is nothing to prove. There is nothing to give evidence of if there isn't an action to show. I can't, but I can show the absence of an action to say that that the absence of that thing doesn't exist. Only stopping in for a second, but it depends. If you mean prove with 100% certainty something non-deductive, you can by definition, but that's not special to negative claims. So I was just explaining, yours here is about logic. It's not about proof. So you saying this is a logical formula, that is true. But you can make whatever you want a premise, and therefore this thing is true. But that's not proof. That's how you find a logical formula. Just because you made premise 2, God doesn't exist, doesn't mean that you have proof that God doesn't exist. You have to, in order to come to a premise, you have to have evidence to get that conclusion. You're not talking about evidence to find proof of something. You're talking about a logical formula. These are unrelated, completely unrelated. Logic and evidence, like you use evidence to form logic, but logic in and of itself is not evidence. So you just saying premise 2, God doesn't exist. Well, where's your evidence of that? Where's your proof that God doesn't exist? Proof in the logical sense can allow negative conclusions. You can prove something negative normally too. Hold on. You're saying something completely different than what I'm saying. You're talking about logic. Logic is not a way to find proof of something. That's not how we find proof of something. We don't do that through logic. You understand what I'm saying, right? Logic is using premises to come to a conclusion, but you have to use proof and evidence in order to gain premises. Premises are not evidence in and of themselves. It speaks to both proofs, Tom. Proof is a logic term usually. My goodness. Not in the same way. No. You again, you use proof or evidence to come to conclusions for your premise. But just having the premise. If I say, prove STK doesn't exist. Well, if I say that STK doesn't exist, then he doesn't exist. Premise 2, STK doesn't exist. Oh, I just proved that STK doesn't exist. Because I used logic to do it. I just made up my logic, but but that's all I have to do. I just have to make it up, and therefore it's proof. Right? I used a logical formula. And so now I have proven that STK doesn't exist. Damn. Proof is an alcoholic term. Yeah. You're misusing the word proof here. It's not like, that's not how you use the word proof. You're distinguishing between logic and evidence, deductive and non. I'm telling either allow for negative conclusions. If you mean something outside of logic, you can't do this with positives. You can have negative conclusions. Conclusions in and of themselves are not proof of anything. If you turn around and say proof is a logical term, again, I'm going to rip my freaking head off. You aren't saying anything right now. Proof, evidence or argument establishing or helping to establish a fact or the truth of the statement. You think a valid argument doesn't evidence a claim? I'm positive you don't understand. It's not that I think. I am 100% positive you are not understanding, because nothing you're saying is anywhere relevant to what it is that I'm saying. Even your example in this TikTok is not relevant. In order for you to have premise 2, you have to have evidence of that. You just claiming it doesn't mean anything. It's not. It's not relevant. Unless you have evidence of that, then you are proving the point. No, it wasn't. This is what I'm saying is you are not understanding. Here, jump into Discord. I'm not talking to you in chat. Stitch and Adam show. I've tried watching their show, man. It's too hard. I can't deal with it. Hey.
Yeah, what's up? What's happening?
Okay, so let's just stick with your example here, okay?
Okay, we're going to do that for a second.
In the TikTok, sure. Okay. So, if theism is true, then God exists, right? Perfectly good. Number 2, God doesn't exist. How do you know God doesn't exist?
Okay. So, you know what the point of the TikTok is, right?
Yes, but if you're going to give an example of how to prove a negative, yet your example doesn't come anywhere close to proving a negative, then I don't see what this proves.
So when it says the argument on the screen, right?
Uh-huh.
Do you agree it's possible that argument is correct?
I don't think you can prove number 2 because that would be a negative.
I'm not saying can I prove. I'm saying, do you agree it's possible that the argument on screen is correct?
Do I don't think you. I don't think you can have premise 2 without proving a negative. Premise 2 is proving the negative.
Wait, hold on a second. So, to be clear, you don't think this argument is possible to make whatsoever?
No, premise 2 is proving the negative. Everything after that doesn't matter. Premise 2, but in and of itself, is proving the negative.
Okay, so just to be clear, you're saying this argument itself is incapable of being made, like in the sense of you cannot make this argument soundly. Why?
Because premise 2 is a negative, and you cannot prove a negative. In order to make the claim,
can
premise
be true
2,
regardless of evidence, right? Like something can be accidentally true, regardless of whether or not there's justification for it, right?
If it's accidentally true and you don't have evidence of it, that means somebody else does.
Does it? So, like,
yes.
For instance, right? Let's say there's some certain scientific hypothesis made about what's going to happen at an exact space-time point far removed from us that we have access to. Mm-hmm. Are you saying that someone has access to that, even though I stipulated that someone can't have access to it by the very definition of the hypothetical?
No. But
yeah, so
that wouldn't be a form of logic.
No, but it's okay. So what I'm saying is basically when someone is saying you cannot prove a negative, they are saying that it is impossible, right? Like can in this case could mean something more reasonable.
So
but I don't think anyone's in.
Technically, you can if you place like very small parameters around it. So if I say, prove that your mom is not in the same room as you right now. Well, you could look around, see that she is not there. But really what you're doing is proving the absence of your mom. You're not proving that she's not there. It's kind of like the absence of your mom is what makes it to where we come to the conclusion that she is not there. But you're not proving that she's not there. You're just proving that there is an absence of your mom, right? So even still, we can limit the parameters, and normally we will accept like parameters like that to where we'll say, okay, under very limited parameters like that, where we can say within that room, you can see your mom is not there. That's pretty close to proving a negative. In reality, you're really just proving the absence of evidence of your mom, not that your mom is not there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and so I was gonna say is obviously I feel like if we've already reached the conclusion that even in a limited circumstance there can be a case where you can prove a negative,
Yeah.
that already fulfills what I was trying to prove. But about the thing that you're talking about, which I think is more generally practical, um, what you're saying is you cannot 100% or definitively beyond any doubt whatsoever demonstrate that your mother is not in the room. You can merely showcase that you have an absence of perception of her being in the room.
Exactly.
Now, yeah, so I would agree to that. My problem with saying that though is when you're saying you can't prove a negative, this is normally framed in the conversation of someone making some affirmative claim and someone making some negative claim. The person who's making the negative claim, in spite of making the negative claim, say God does not exist, will say, I don't have to prove that. You have to prove that God does in fact exist. I don't have to prove shit because you're the one making the claim that's positive.
That's
But what
true.
I would say, yeah, but what I would say is if you're asking for the person who is of the negative position to make the claim and then the argument beyond any reasonable doubt, not even reasonable doubt, beyond a shadow of a doubt whatsoever, that the claim that God doesn't exist is true. I mean, the person who's a theist or a deist or whatever, whoever's claiming God exists, can make the same case, right? Like, are you expecting them to show beyond any reasonable doubt, or not even reasonable, again, like I said, any shadow of a doubt whatsoever that God does in fact exist? Like, no, neither of them have to prove it to 100% certainty.
Right,
So I
but
don't see why the
that's
person is especially privileged.
so normally we consider
Mm-hmm.
that a neutral stance. And that's why we say that you can't prove a negative, is because the neutral stance is until there is evidence, nothing exists. Nothing has happened and nothing exists until there is evidence of such thing, right? But that's just saying there is a lack of evidence, therefore I don't believe it, or therefore I don't believe that there's enough proof to say that it has happened. But to prove that something hasn't happened, it's literally impossible. All you can prove is that you don't have evidence that that thing has happened, right? So if somebody says, prove that the Nazis, never came to America and killed anybody. Well, I can't do that. All I can do is tell you that either you have to prove that the Nazis did come to America and kill a bunch of people, or we're just going to go to a neutral stance that says it hasn't happened until we have evidence of it.
Yeah, and so what I would say is this is specifically what a lot of theists, because this is normally what it's brought up in the conversation of, from what I've seen. It's normally brought up on the behalf of atheists trying to explain why they don't have to make arguments.
Yeah.
So what I would say is if we're talking from a place and concern of practicability, the atheist does have some burden if they are saying God does not exist. Now, if they want to retract that claim and make it more something that sounds agnostic in nature, which is the position that you're leveraging, right? Someone saying, I don't know if that's the case. If there's an argument that can convince me, obviously I'll accept it.
Right.
That's obviously different, right? But if someone's saying something is not the case, when you say something is not the case, you're not just saying, "Oh, I'm not sure," right? That's different from saying, "I don't think that's the case," right? Like if you, for instance, were telling me like, "Oh, today I went to work and stuff," and I'm like, "I don't think you have a job." That's not me saying, "Oh, I actually, I'm very agnostic as to whether or not you have a job. I need you to prove that beyond any certainty whatsoever." Like, no, that's not how people talk. So that would specifically be the issue. People are just asking, in essence, for the people who say they don't have a burden to prove anything, to make their claim not affirmative or negative in nature, to not really make a claim whatsoever, merely just admit you don't know. If you don't know, that's different from saying something is not the case or is the case.
Well, it's kind of not. Like if being agnostic means that I don't think this has happened until I see evidence of it, then a neutral claim would be that it hasn't happened because I don't have evidence otherwise, right? Just as your mom not being in the room only means that you don't have evidence that she is in the room. So you're going to come out with the claim that she's not in the room, but you don't have proof that she's not in the room. You only don't have evidence that she is in the room. So like
But
in
I would say
common
that is evidence.
parlance, with common parlance, like with the job thing, sure, like that's the way that people normally talk. But within logic or within science, we don't use those sorts of definitive terms because it's impossible to make that sort of claim outright. You can only say that there's a lack of something instead of saying definitively that something is there, or sorry, that something isn't there.
And that's my point though, right? Like, if someone is saying something is not the case, that carries a stronger connotation of this is incorrect. This is not what happened. It's negatively an occurrence. Like, this just did not happen whatsoever, right? That's the kind of claim that people are going to be hearing. And so if that's not what's being said, obviously a more effective communication of that is just, I don't know. I'm not sure.
Well, so
right?
what? But like I said, wouldn't that be the same thing if I say until you show me evidence that there is a God, I will take the neutral stance that there definitely is not a God.
Neutral is agnostic.
Right.
I
well,
don't think that saying
kind
there's
of.
not a God is a neutral stance, unless you mean it agnostically.
I think that saying there is no evidence of this thing, normally we would say, therefore, I don't believe that that exists. I think that that's
But
like
people believe things without evidence all the time.
Sure,
right?
but that's not
Like,
what we're talking about. We're talking about like with through a logical formula, whether or not you can prove a negative. And so if somebody believes something without evidence, there is no logical formula there. So that's just faith. But through a logical formula, can you prove a negative? No, but we normally take a neutral stance, which is this does not exist until I see evidence otherwise.
yeah, I mean, what you're basically telling me right now is that you think it's the case that just because someone in one case might use a very strong and logical sense of that phrase, yes, it is the case that you can prove a negative, but in like most conventional senses, using that same logical term, that we can't achieve that same logical sense in a conventional situation. What I'm telling you is, I don't think it makes sense to try and choose a logic term and place it into an unconventional sense, right? Or excuse me, in a conventional sense, where like we're just having a normal get together or something, and then suddenly you choose to start talking in like logic word terms. Like, I think that's
Yeah, of
misplaced.
course. But in any debate,
Mm-hmm.
you are using logic. Like it's necessary to use logic within a debate. So if somebody makes a negative claim, I think it would therefore be necessary to say you can't prove that negative claim. So you can't make that claim.
But that's what I'm saying. You're saying that we are using logic, but logic says we can prove negatives. So then going back to you cannot prove negatives is just bizarre. Even
Wait,
in science, that's where the idea of
I didn't say
falsification
that.
comes from. Oh, what are you saying then? My bad.
I'm saying that you can't prove a negative, that we take a neutral stance that something does not exist until there is evidence otherwise or proof otherwise. We can't prove that the neutral stance is correct. We can't prove that a negative stance is correct. We can only look for positive claims and positive evidence to say otherwise.
No, I don't even think that's the case, right? Like, okay, in science, for instance, we could look at a bunch of competitive explanations that are trying to equally explain or best explain what's happening with some sort of physical phenomena. Let's say it's A, B, and C. So explanations A, B, and C exist. Um, some claim could be like explanation A is the best one. What that would mean is, if it's true, and say we could showcase that through like parsimony and explanatory virtue and all that other science bullshit, if we could showcase all of that, that would mean by default that B and C are wrong.
I I don't disagree with you, but you would have to have evidence of those.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. You can prove a negative in like pretty much every sense of the word.
But I haven't gotten an example yet of proving a negative.
Science. Science.
Like what?
Okay? When we're talking about and I mean, you even talk about this when you're talking about like political science or economics. When you're saying some given set of articles explain the best explanation of some particular phenomena, you're saying the other ones are not the best, right? Or similarly with just different types of positions, it doesn't even have to be exclusive to a social science or a hard science.
Yeah, but I
So when
wouldn't
you're
say
saying, go ahead.
sorry, I wouldn't say that that's a negative though. Like each one is still a positive claim, just one has more evidence than the other.
But that implies a negative, right? Because they can't all be the best, correct?
I don't know by the best. Like one has the most evidence, but that's still not proving a
So like,
that there is no evidence, right?
for instance, if you say, as an example, that Lauren Southern won her debate with BPF, reasonably, what you're saying is he did not win, correct?
Yes. But I
Yeah,
don't
so that
know that
implies
that's
a
the
negative.
same
Yeah.
as a negative.
Well, saying he did not win is like what it means to be a negative claim, right? Like
Kind
it's
of,
saying
because
something is not the case.
I think somebody can lose something or win something, and each one of those would still be a positive claim because they're like, just because they're opposites doesn't mean that one's a positive and one's a negative, because both require um, a a positive claim in order to make them. She lost that
So
race. What's the evidence? Well, I can show you on the marker that she came in last. So there's evidence that she came in last, but this isn't a negative claim. This is still a positive claim.
so how familiar? Okay, you've like heard about little logic and shit here and there, right?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, so you ever heard of what's called a double negation or no?
The Q can't equal P if P I can't
It's like no, it's so basically all it's saying is like um in what's called classical logic, we just have two values, right? A statement can either be true or false, assuming the law of excluded middle, so it could be true and false. Um, and because it can only be one of those two things. If we know that it's not false, that means it's positive, or in the sense of it's true, right? Or if we know it's not true on a bivalent logic, one where it's only true or false, then we know it's the case that it's false, right? Because it's not true, and so the only other possible option is that it's false,
Correct.
right?
But
So
again,
yeah,
we would normally call that the neutral stance. That, like, without any evidence otherwise, that is the part, that's the starting point. Nobody starts at the point that something is true, right? You start at who knows. And that who knows is the same as saying it's not true. Those are both the same exact thing. But you can't prove that
right.
it's not true. You can only wait until there is evidence otherwise.
What I'm saying is, in classical logic, you can prove something's like false, right, or negative in that sense. You can prove that, for instance, through explaining how one person won a debate versus another person, someone's the loser, or that they did not win, right? And so if you're telling me, well, it seems like that has positive attributions, you could say the same thing about really any statement whatsoever if you just assume like bivalent logic, because it goes back to the double negation thing, right? If you're saying it's
Correct. But
not
real
false,
quick,
that means it's true or positive.
it's
Yeah.
still, so it is a double negation, but that's still something that happened in the end. Whereas a negative would be something that didn't happen. So yes, they did not win, but you can but the positive claim is still that they lost, right?
Uh huh. And you can have evidence of that.
Right. And the double negation would be evidence that they lost.
Right. And so, like, negative claim doesn't mean that, and you can use this in, like, absence of an existence sense or whatever. You can use it in that way as well. But they're, like, obviously forms of logic that can do that. They're obviously real world examples where you can say, okay, like we have a book. Does this book contain a description of something? Okay, in that particular book, that description is not contained after we've read the book. Now that's not necessarily guaranteed or anything, but that is a reasonable reason. Or excuse me, that's a reasonable evidence to believe in the claim that that description does not exist in some book, right, or in the particular book that we've read.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
again, I
So
think in common parlance, I think you're correct. I think in logic we just don't normally use these terms in that way, because If there is a positive claim to make on it, then it is a positive claim. Whereas, like, I can't make a positive claim as to whether or not your mom isn't in the room. There isn't a positive claim to make there. Therefore, it's only a negative claim. And I can't show evidence that your mom isn't in the room. I can only show the lack of evidence that she is in the room. And so we go to a neutral stance that we don't know whether or not she's in the room. We just know that there's absolutely no evidence that she's in the room. So we would still be at a neutral stance, but we can never show evidence that she's not in the room. That's not possible.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I was gonna say is obviously it's the case that I mean, like you can't prove something guaranteed beyond any doubt whatsoever. Basically, what I'm just saying is, in logic, we don't even really make the distinction between positive and negative claims. Like I mean, in like logic article, I could show you, or like in logic textbooks or whatever, we don't even really make that distinction.
Really?
We'll make the distinction between we don't. Like I can give you books if you want, or if you want to look at like something like Wolfram Alpha, for instance, you could look, but they don't really make the distinction there. We'll make distinctions based on whether or not something's true or untrue or provable or unprovable, but we don't really make the distinction between positive and negative claim because of basically the double negation thing, right? Like if some claim is like false, that is negative, but if you're saying that some claim is not false or true, that's technically also negative because it's double negative, right?
Mm. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's like technically a philosophical term, and obviously logic comes from philosophy, but um I forget where exactly I learned this because I remember the first couple times I was going through the same thought process as you over and over that, well, lack of proof actually is the opposite of there being proof. Therefore, that is proof of the negative. But somehow
No,
that,
it's not that I think lack of proof is that. So it's
well,
like
not even just that. Say we
yeah.
prove your mom's in a different room, right?
Uh-huh.
Isn't that also proof that she's not in the other room? Like
Yeah.
if we prove that she's in another room, have we proved that she's not in the room with you? Well, that's what I thought. I thought, well, that is proof because it's only one or the other. There isn't another option. Either she's in the room with him or she's in that other room. Her being in that other room proves the negative. But from reading a bunch on it, like apparently it only proves the neutral claims that you don't know if she's in the other room. You only know that she's in that room.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that there aren't some cases where some claim is like not capable of being falsified or proven to be wrong. But I mean, we already agreed on this. You can pretty much prove a negative in like a colloquial sense, in a logic sense, and then the kind of case that you're describing. Even if we say that the cases I'm describing are more like fringe outliers, even in the case that you're describing, though, like that would just mean that the claim itself isn't really provable, but you can proportion claims that are probably a little more conventional, and that might be the task at hand for people to make more proportion claims. Like people will overstep boundaries all the time in terms of making claims for positions that they can't really justify.
Yeah,
Right?
so it is useful in the way that you're talking about. I still don't agree that you
uh,
can prove a negative because if somebody makes a negative claim like God doesn't exist, I can't tell them to prove that because they can't show evidence that God doesn't exist. So it would still
well, if
be
they
the
could prove that
case.
God's logically impossible, they could, which would make it a possible like thing, right?
How could it be logically impossible, though?
Someone could say that there's the interaction problem, there's the problem of evil. Someone could say that God has problems on omniscience. Like there are a bunch of logical problems that people have tried to make about God, and so the only possibility you need to actually accept here is just that any one of those might be successful in showing the logical impossibility of God.
But
which means that it is possible to prove a negative.
aren't they only showing that that those characteristics are um are or that those characteristics are illogical, but not that God would be illogical?
Well, God's defined in terms of having those characteristics, right? That's like saying tomfoolery is defined in terms of having a black T-shirt. But here's a reason why someone with a black T-shirt can't exist, but also Tom exists. It's like, okay, if it's logically impossible for something with that property to exist, I don't know how you, in the case of someone who's wearing the logically impossible black T-shirt, is still existing, despite that being something that would make you non-existent.
Yeah, I suppose. I guess I wouldn't personally never allow those stipulations in a debate, but yeah, I guess
I'm not saying that like in a like an everyday case like you're going to be able to get this like crazy definite proof or whatever. It's just that
yeah.
you can. And so I think if someone's saying like, okay, reasonably speaking, like the thing that I have to try and prove is like way more difficult. I'm way more burdened. But I think if you make that admission, someone like an atheist probably has a harder time arguing because it's saying that okay, I have the harder case to make, and I don't even really have any arguments. So it's like, okay, so why do you even believe in that? That would put an atheist in a disadvantaged position, and that's why I think a lot of, and I'm saying this as an atheist, right? But I think that's why a lot of atheists will turn to saying that you just can't do it whatsoever. It's just a form of laziness.
Hmm. It's based on the claim that you make. I don't think that I hear what you're saying. I still don't think that you can make the claim
Mm-hmm.
that I can prove God doesn't exist. I don't think I understand what you're saying, but those are based on stipulations, and you're only actually disproving the stipulations, not God. So you're disproving it based on the stipulations, but in the end, the only thing that you're like uh disproving is the stipulation in and of itself. So I can show that this stipulation doesn't exist, but in order to do that, I would still have to go through a positive logical thought process in order to do it. And in the end, I only disprove uh, that that stipulation based on a lack of evidence or an illogical thought process, right?
Well, what I would say to kind of push back on this, if you're talking about like this only sort of like hurting a stipulation, it hurts like an aspect of it, obviously, like we agree on that, but I think that impacts saying that you can say the thing with that aspect exists. So if, for instance, like we're talking about going to a club and there's just like the perfect bouncer, you can keep out anybody they don't want from coming inside, and people with black t-shirts aren't allowed inside. If you're wearing a black t-shirt like you are in your avatar and then you try and come inside, the perfect bouncer is going to keep you out, right?
Uh-huh.
So if you do in fact have a black T-shirt, like yes, that's an aspect of you. That's not all of what you are, right? You're not just a black T-shirt. You're also tomfoolery. But at the same time, that black T-shirt is disqualifying you from entering into the club. And in the same way, if some aspect of you is quite literally impossible, that is disqualifying you from entering the metaphorical club of just logical discourse.
I don't know. I'm gonna have to go back through some of these logical processes because I don't. I feel like you can make the claim. So say we say the bouncer won't allow white people into the club. I
Oh my
feel
lord, you
like
made this.
we can make the claim that white people are not in the club, but that I don't know that we can therefore logically follow that Tom is not in the club because he is. Yeah, I guess we have to. If Tom is not in the club because he is white, then we would have to first. So yeah, we're showing
Yeah.
lack of evidence.
And I mean, Crucible Clip seems really smart. I don't know who that is specifically. I don't know if that's like BPF or whoever,
It's
but they
one
seem to
of
know about
BPF's
this as well.
people.
Yeah, like they seem to know about this as well, so maybe they can explain it better than I can because they've given a lot of good examples. But yeah, like they're giving some good examples if you want to read over that. If you want me to send you anything for any of the claims I made specifically, unless I said something where I misspoke, in which case I can just clarify, I can send you something. But yeah, it's like the club thing, right? Like people who are allowed in, or people with like non-black t-shirts, and then if you have a black t-shirt, okay, no go for you. And so I mean, like, even if you're not just your black t-shirt, you're still not allowed in. So you as someone with a black t-shirt wouldn't be allowed in.
Okay. So yeah, I think it's like A is not A,
Mhm.
and or sorry.
He's saying A is not A.
Yeah. A is
Mhm.
not A. So therefore if you prove B, then not A is also proven. Or it logically follows. Not that it's proven,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Well,
Okay.
okay, and that's like, yeah, it's kind of the
So that's the
I think that's part of
distinction
the
that you're
trouble.
making. Okay. I get you
Yeah.
now.
But yeah, that's all I had to say. I don't know if you have anything else, but yeah, that's all for me.
Okay. All right. Appreciate it, man.
Yep. Yeah, you have a good one.
You too. See. Okay. I really wanted to get through this Demon Mama video, but I'm so tired now. What were y'all talking about? We're talking about whether or not you can prove a negative. So I still feel as though his video is wrong, though I think we can say that a negative can logically follow. I don't know. I don't think that I would call that proof, but because normally proof is more about evidence than it is what would logically follow evidence. But I that's the part that I was saying. I'm not sure um about what we would call proof in a logical formula. And how Tom has 50 black shirts. I literally have like probably like 20 to 30 different black shirts. That's why I put my logo on black shirts, is because I was always wearing black t-shirts. I think I might be wearing one. Yep. Black short sleeve t-shirt. Okay. I am going to go to sleep. Reality doesn't have the casual always. That's why we can say you can't prove a negative and really not be wrong. Yeah, but if you say that, Crucible, what you're saying actually isn't that you can't prove a negative. What you're saying is that you can't prove anything. And I don't think that that's like when we talk about the burden of proof, I think that we can look at a certain amount of evidence and say that this is I can't think of what you would call it, surpassed the burden of proof, or has qualified for the burden of proof. I know that that's not right, but like we can say something has a reasonable amount of evidence to where it is qualified, or it is within the burden of proof. But I don't think we can say that for a negative. But I think we can say that it logically follows. But whereas you're saying there's no always, that would say that literally nothing is provable. And that's true, nothing's provable beyond a matter of a doubt. We live in a quantum reality of correlation, not causation. Causation hasn't been proven. Yeah. Or we can't prove that. Yes, we can't prove that causation or that cause and effect are a real thing. But we can prove that an effect is a real thing. Or I guess you can't say it's an effect unless something caused it. So I think I just became a nihilist, guys.